So, I guess people have sorted themselves out. Everybody's in the room they want to be in. Good morning.
Morning.
My name's Armin Briegel. You might know my website, Scripting OS 10. I also work as a systems engineer for a Dutch enterprise reseller called Pro Warehouse. Today, my clicker wasn't awake yet, now it is. We are going to talk about modern deployment workflows for business. Now the title modern implies there's a traditional way of doing it. And at first I would kind of like to look at where we're coming from, because obviously that's kind of relevant to where we're going to. And as so many things with Apple, it started with this, at least from my perspective. The iPhone, we all know, was kind of a big success, kind of reshaped how Apple works, kind of reshaped how we work and the entire industry. Of course, there are lots of things that happen along with the iPhone that the iPhone may not have caused, but maybe accelerated. So when the iPhone came out, people liked it. People wanted to use it. And people wanted to use it with their work. They wanted to access work resources from their iPhone. And many, many companies weren't really prepared for that at that time. And you had your work resources. They were kind of firewalled off, literally, in their own network. And it was kind of hard to get to them. And all the company devices were in the same network, and everything was fine there. But mobile devices, like the iPhone, kind of had a problem to get there. And of course, there was VPN, which had been serving for that for a long time, and you kind of could make that work with the iPhone. And then we added other things, like certificates exchanges, like SCEP and ADCS, to get the certificates out there, to make the connection even more secure and encrypted. And then technologies like conditional access that would check on that even more and lock down control and access to the things behind the firewall. And these things worked well. So companies decided, well, this is working well. Let's not use this just for the mobile phones and other devices. Let's put everything outside the firewall and access through these secure technologies. And that was an improvement. And maybe not all the clients, but just some of the clients. And that didn't help just the iPhone, but it also helped Apple's other platforms like the iPad and, yes, the Mac. Because these devices could also use those same technologies to access the internal services that needed to be secure. And at the same time, and as I said, these things didn't necessarily happen in order or one after the other. Services move to the cloud. And in the cloud, they have all their own access controls and firewalls, maybe through the same technologies that we use for the internal services. And again, this opens up, makes it multi-platform, and maybe switches one or two of the Windows devices or traditional devices to the Mac as well. So 10, 15 years ago, the requirements for working in enterprise, for working in business, were Microsoft, basically. There were a few other things, but it was basically you had to have Microsoft Office for productivity. You had to have Exchange, maybe IMAP, for communication, mail. Back then, there wasn't much more else to communication. Identity management was mainly Active Directory, maybe some LDAP every now and then. And file sharing was Samba Sys, Windows file sharing, maybe some NFS. Today, well, things have changed and yet not. Productivity, Office 365. The G Suite from Google is definitely a contender and is being used. More over there in the other room in education, but we encounter it in businesses and enterprises as well. Apple has decent solution with iWork, but I'm using Keynote. I love Keynote. I like numbers for most of what I use spreadsheets for, but I'm not a professional spreadsheet user. Communication, Office 365, which is, of course, the successor to Exchange. And again, G Suite from Google, very strong there. And then other solutions are coming up there, which are not necessarily just email and calendaring, like Slack, are moving up here. Identity management, Azure AD, Okta, Jump Cloud, Ping, OneLog, and I ran out of space. There are so many great cloud solutions out there right now for the identity management that do more than just store your directory, but mainly that's what they have to do. And then file sharing, OneDrive, Google Drive, Dropbox, Box, and way more than in that list. As I said, things have changed. We have more options now, but things have also kind of stayed the same because Microsoft is still there in all of these. And these are great solutions. We use them all the time. I'm not saying that to diss Microsoft. One thing that is remarkable, though, with the possible, maybe, exception of iWork, Apple is not in this business at all, anywhere. Apple has ceded this business completely. They have chosen not to play there. So we have this setup. This is kind of like where we are, maybe in a hybrid solution. If you're a smaller, younger company, you might be completely in the cloud and not have the old internal network at all anymore. You're probably somewhere in between on this setup. And however you got there, or whether you're still going there, this new setup has not only benefited the iPhone, but it has dragged along the Mac with it. Because the iPhone and all the other mobile devices, of course, as Apple people, we think mainly about the iPhone first, but all the other mobile devices and development have made this development work, and it has kind of dragged the Mac along with it. The halo effect is real. Because of these new setups, the Mac now has a much better proposition than it had 10, 15 years ago in businesses. This has led to some things that companies like to call employee choice programs. IBM started it very prominently. SAP is a very big European example on how these work. And the idea is that these people that we're hiring into the companies, they are experts in what they do. They know best which tools are good for them. And if they want Macs, and if they can do their job with Macs, well then let's give them Macs, or iPhones, or iPads, or whatever device they think is best for their job. So user choice comes first. Also because it's a mobile fleet, mobile users, mobile employees, we need modern deployment workflows that work anywhere, not just in our intranet. The devices are personalized. Like my computer here is very personalized. My iPhone is a very personal device. People expect their tools to be personal. And it sounds kind of silly, but this out-of-the-box experience, when you get that new shrink-wrapped MacBook or iPhone, that just makes it somewhat yours, and you take better care of your machine as well. You can also further personalize your computer with self-service and by installing stuff. You're responsible for your device. It's not IT is responsible, you are responsible. IT is there to help you. That leads to new support models. In such a flexible, open world, your tech support has to be able to handle different questions and other kinds of questions. And they may not be the expert on a certain product. The users certainly should be the expert on a certain product. So we want shared support models. And overall, all of these things kind of lead to a lower total cost of ownership. You're shifting some things around. Some things just simply get cheaper. Some things are accounted differently. But overall, you save money. IBM claims several $100 over the lifetime of a mobile device, of a laptop. So we have all these transitions going on, from desktops and workstations to mobile devices, whether they're cell phones, tablets, or laptops. We have on-premise servers are moving into the cloud, whether you manage them yourself in the cloud or whether it's hosted in the cloud. More and more things are moving to cloud services, which is somebody else's server room, but there's advantages to that. Boxed software and licensed software is moving to subscriptions. We heard all about that yesterday, subscriptions. Corporate choice is moving to user choice. The users should be empowered. They're the experts in their field. They should make the right choices. In the same time, over the last few years, Apple has had a few transitions of their own, very specific to the Apple space. And since I blog about this, I got to blog a lot about these. And these are the most prominent changes that happened, I would say, in the last 2 years, 18 months. Imaging, NetBoot, macOS server, they're all kind of gone. And we know what happened now in retrospect. We know the killer was T2. not that one, this one. The T2 system controller that Apple put in the new Macs, starting with the iMac Pro in late 2017. Yes. It changed a lot for the Mac business. And many things that we would kind of see coming before that were suddenly made very, very real. It provides secure boot, which is a great thing. It checks the integrity of the system before the Mac even boots. You know if somebody has meddled with your system or your firmware because your Mac will say, hey, no, I'm not going to boot from that. Somebody messed with this. It gives us things like the secure enclave, which we've had on the phone for a long time. Well, not that long, but comparatively. And it gives us things like Touch ID and secure storage for certificates and keys and all of this thing. Disk encryption at rest. The SSDs in Secure Boot Macs are always encrypted. If you rip out the SSD, it's encrypted garbage. You need that particular T2 controller to decrypt the drive. And all you do when you enable File Vault is you add another password on top of that to unlock the encryption, which gives us instant File Vault. It doesn't take hours anymore to turn File Vault on. There's a flip side to the system controller. They killed NetBoot. You can argue whether there's a technological reason for this, or Apple just decided we're not going to do NetBoot anymore. Fact is, Secure Boot Macs don't do NetBoot. There's no way to turn it back on. You can't sneak an installation in over target disk mode, or some other means. There are very, very limited ways where you can still image Secure Boot Macs, but it's very, very limited. External boot is turned off by default on Secure Boot Macs. We can't even boot off an installer USB drive anymore. You can turn it on, but the process to turn it on is so convoluted, there's no way to automate it. It doesn't scale. It works for test machines, but it doesn't scale to anything on fleet size. And it requires the internet connection during the installation so it can get the latest firmware, and at first boot to verify the installation that it hasn't been tampered with, and to do some activation, iOS style. We're used to that from iOS. Now Macs require this too. And when we say internet connection, we mean open internet, not a firewalled internet. We have to be able to talk with Apple servers, and maybe some servers that aren't that well documented. Yeah. As of now, and thankfully this didn't change last night, the iMac Pro was the first one to have the T2 system controller, and the MacBook Pro with the touch bar, the MacBook Air Retina, and the Mac Mini that was introduced last fall. Those all have Secure Boot Macs, Secure Boot controllers. We talked about the casualties. There are a few zombies hanging around as well. And I was told to stay in the spotlight. You can tell it makes me a bit uncomfortable, but I'll try. We have a few zombies hanging around, which I think are services and software that is updated by Apple that still works fine, but hasn't really gotten any major care in the last few years. And their future is kind of like, yeah, I don't know. Open Directory Server was officially deprecated in server version 5.4. I think that was nearly 3 years ago. It still hangs around because there are other services that depend on it, like XAN. But yeah, XAN, another one of those things, still works fine. If you're using it, it works fine. But what's up with XAN? There are a few more. Remote Desktop, Apple Remote Desktop. Still works, We actually got some changes regarding remote desktop in 10.14.4. But yeah, also remote desktop has been kind of superseded by all the MDM and other developments. The purpose that remote desktop was initially used for, not so much there anymore. Active Directory plugin. Again, I won't say works fine. Works most of the time. It's been superseded by other developments like the identity managers in the cloud. Mobile devices shouldn't be continuously bound. The Mac Mini got a great update last year. Really, really wonderful device. I'm very excited about it. I just wanted to remind you, there's no server edition anymore. Hasn't been in the previous, very old update. This one didn't get one either. And I need to repeat that. Apple is not in the server business. They have given up on that. For whatever internal motivation, this is not happening anymore, and Apple won't U-turn on that, at least not in the near future. We have to come to grips with that if you haven't already. That doesn't mean that Apple doesn't like businesses. Apple likes enterprise and businesses. And they have developed new stuff over the last years, over the last decade. Foremost is the MDM protocol, which started out for iOS and then moved to the Macs in Lion 10.7 and has been growing and growing and expanded ever since. The MDM protocol works closely together with the Apple push notification service, which isn't necessarily an enterprise thing, but works so close together right now that we really have to understand how that works. And then we got the device enrollment program and the volume purchase program, where we can buy apps and push apps from the App Store. And the last two have last year been rebranded as Apple Business Manager and Apple School Manager, respectively. And Apple Business Manager and Apple School Manager do a bit more than that, but you will hear me using DEP and VPP a lot, and the Apple people in the audience will cringe, but I don't care. So what does the modern deployment workflow now look like? And this is a very high level, this is satellite view. You get the new Mac, you do some initial configuration and install some software to get it going, and then you enter the maintenance cycle. The maintenance cycle should be managed by your management software, Jamf, AirWatch, Monkey, the MDM working together with a local agent to keep the software and to keep the configuration on the device where it should be. It's an endless loop. You have updates to maintain. You have to check, is File Vault still on? Did the user turn it off for some weird reason? Is system integrity protection turned off for some reason? Well, we should turn it back on. And all of these things. This is an endless cycle, and we're not going to talk about that today, even though, as admins, this is the bulk of our work. I'm interested in the green area, the initial configuration, the deployment area. And I would split that into two pieces. The first one is connected to your management system. Enroll with the MDM, install the management agent. This is the very first, very, very essential step. And the second step is, well, then there's a few other configurations you have to do once those are going. For these other configurations, you use configuration profiles for the settings, VPP, maybe for some apps, and scripts and packages for everything that the other two don't cover. And when we compare that with the maintenance cycle that happens later, well, the maintenance cycle I do with configuration profiles for the settings where they work, VPP, MDM commands where they work, and script and packages for everything else. So I have the same tools for the initial software deployment as I do for the maintenance. And it really makes sense to think about the very initial, the very first software deployment as the same thing as my later maintenance. In your workflow, there shouldn't be a difference between installing Google Chrome for the first time and configuring it and installing and managing the latest update of Google Chrome or whatever piece of software, which reduces the deployment part to just the initial, connect to the MDM. And in our modern Mac deployment, MDM is essential. It used to be that we could ignore MDM. Up until 10.13, you could just use Monkey and not use MDM, and you'd be fine. But with 10.13, that changed. MDM is now very, very essential. You can't get around it. And even more, you need a user-approved MDM to make it really work. And the culprit at this time was the kernel extension whitelist. In 10.13, Apple decided third-party kernel extensions are really, really bad, and the user has to know what they're doing and click OK for every single one of them. Now, on a large fleet, if we're managing that, that is obviously bad, clicking OK for every third party. So Apple had this idea, well, OK, we don't want the user to click OK for every one of them. We'll move it one step up. And the user has to approve the MDM once, and the MDM can approve everything in their stead. So we got the kernel extension whitelist in 10.13.4, and user-approved MDMs in 10.13.4. And this extended in 10.14 with Mojave, with the privacy preferences policy control, which we used to that on iOS. On iOS, the phone will ask you all the time, this app wants to access your contacts. This app wants to access your photos. This app wants to access your microphone. And you say, OK, OK, OK. And we got that in Mojave on the Mac as well, which in general is a good thing. But again, if we're managing things, we want to whitelist. We want to pre-approve certain things. So these dialogues, we're all used to them by now. And now we can build privacy preferences policy control profiles, PCP, to whitelist that from the MDM. But since this is something that requires user approval, it requires a user-approved MDM. The user has to approve at least once. As far as I can tell, the documentation has not been updated for 10.14.4 yet, so there might be some additions to this. There are 3 things that require user-approved MDM: kernel extension whitelist, and the privacy preferences policy control profiles are the most essential ones. Autonomous single app mode, again, probably more for the next room. On the Mac, also requires a user-approved MDM. User approval can be given in 3 ways. It happens during automated device enrollment with DEP. When the user clicks continue here, and a local user has to click continue here, user approval is given. When you install the MDM profile by double-clicking the profile file, you will get this dialog with a nice warning. This looks different in different versions of macOS. When you click install, user approval is given. If the MDM profile is installed through a script or a package, user approval can't be given at that time because it's an automated process. User approval can be given afterwards in the profiles preference pane. User has to find that small button and click approve. Fun times. MDM servers are essential now. We can't get around one. We need one. Thankfully, there are a lot of vendors, and there's good and healthy competition. And this is not a complete list. I've probably forgotten 1 or 2. Being on this list is not an endorsement from me. But I tried to make this slide as full as possible. I think that's a good thing. We have a choice now as Mac admins. That didn't used to be the case. I mean, 15 years ago, there were like, yeah, you can use Deploy Studio or NetBoot, and Bombitch's Net Restore. All great tools, but now we have more choice. So the enroll and approve stage of deployment, that's the crucial one when you talk about deployment. And you should minimize that to as little as possible. I see many people in the Mac admin Slack who try to make the enrollment process like their replacement for imaging. They throw everything in there. Oh yeah, and I can install Office and Google Chrome and configure this and that. You shouldn't put that in the enroll and approve phase. The enroll and approve phase should connect to your MDM, find a way to get it user approved, configure your management agent, and depending on how secure your network is, you probably need a step to connect to the network before that, or not. Everything else should be done by the management system afterwards. And some things will kick in, of course, immediately and install, but it's the management system's problem. At this point, your management system can take over. So there are two choices. I've mentioned them before, and just for the repetition, we can use automated device enrollment or manual enrollment. Manual enrollment is pretty much what we said. Double-click the MDM profile, run a package or a script, and approve. Automated device enrollment is where it's interesting. DEP, automated device enrollment. Device enrollment. Depending on where you look in Apple's documentation, you will find all three of these. Automated device enrollment is mostly transparent to the user. That's a really cool thing. There's a lot of work to get it going. The devices have to be enrolled from the vendor in your account, and then you have to assign them in Apple Business Manager to your MDM. As everything that looks magic and automated, there's a lot of work in the background. But it's mostly transparent to the user. Most users will not realize they're giving user approval when they click that button, which is a good thing. It requires network access during the first boot and startup, which we need to provide anyway because Mojave and the secure boot chip expects that. But it is something that you need to plan for, and the network access has to be open to Apple's 17 network and a few other servers that aren't documented. Enrollment is automatically user approved. Well, not automatically, but it will be user approved afterwards. The MDM can then use the install application or the newer install enterprise application MDM command to push extra software like the local agent that is required because the MDM protocol is getting better but doesn't cover everything yet. This is a great way to configure the Mac and push configuration before the user is even created. If you want to use something like Nomad login, Jamf Connect login to completely change how the user creation works in macOS, this is the time to do it. There are ways of doing it without device enrollment, but they're a bit harder. And it requires user interaction at first boot. I cannot automate this user interaction away. User approval still must be given. This dialog has to be confirmed with the continue button. I cannot automate this, at least now. There are very few things that require device enrollment. One of them is if you want the MDM profile to be not removable by the user, device enrollment is your only option. There are certain MDM commands to schedule the updates and to manipulate and manage the users that also require DEP. And with 10.14.4, we got a new feature that we can configure and enable remote desktop connections through the MDM. I haven't looked at the details yet. It only came out yesterday. But that also, I think, requires DEP if I read the release notes correctly. This can lead to a new style of deployment that we hadn't had before, that wasn't possible before, zero-touch deployment. When Apple and the MDM vendors call it zero-touch deployment, they mean zero-touch by IT. The user still has to touch and do things. But it allows you to ship and send devices directly, shrink-wrapped, from the vendor and reseller to the users. They get the wonderful out-of-box experience, the new MacBook smell, and they can, everything else happens magically in the background. It will require a lot of preparation from you, but we can provide this experience, and it is a really good experience. Again, there's a flip side to this. There is very little feedback from the enrollment process to the user. This is a good and a bad thing. You don't want unnecessary feedback, but some large installations like Microsoft Office or even the Adobe Creative Cloud Suite, they take a long time. And there's no progress bar or anything, and the user will be like, well, where's my Outlook? Where's my Excel? Where's Photoshop? It's installing in the background. There are two solutions to this. The first one is to use the self-service portals. This is the Monkey Managed Software Center, a Jamf self-service, AirWatch Workspace. I don't know what they're all called. Your management system probably has a self-service portal. You can use those. Don't automatically install Office. Let the user go there and choose to install it. Then they get a nice progress bar. They've taken control of the process. They kind of possess more of the system that way. Or you use a first boot UI tool. And I didn't know Joel would be sitting in the first row. Otherwise, I wouldn't be mentioning him all the time. But of course, Step Notify is a wonderful tool to use. In addition to giving progress information on the initial installations, you can throw up a dialog where the user enters information. And that will influence like the asset tag and the department. And that can influence your workflow. SplashBuddy is another tool. SplashBuddy, as far as I know, only works with Jamf, but same approach, somewhat different UI, can also prompt for user input during the enrollment. Very, very flexible UI here because this is basically just a web page that you can give your web designers and they can go along with it. And last year, we also got the one that started it all. IBM has open sourced their enrollment tool, Mac@IBM. And there will be links. I will have a link with all the other links later. So that is open sourced and available, and you can adapt that to your workflow. So there's a great amount of tools that are emerging and available for this. So this is the workflow we have to work with. The main challenge is connect to the MDM, get it user approved, get the management agent there. And from then on, it's business as usual. Let your management system do the work for you. And of course, you have to feed that and configure it. There's this orange arrow at the bottom. At some point, you want to return to start because a user is leaving and handing the device back in, or because it's just so messed up that you want to start over. So the erase and reinstall. And with imaging, that was easy because you just re-image. That had the erase part built in. Now without imaging, we kind of need a new strategy for that. And thankfully, we have a great tool that Apple gave us, which is kind of under the radar for some. But it's now an essential toolkit for the Mac admins, and that's the Install macOS app. And it changes name. The macOS installer app, the Install macOS app. I have not found a proper name for it, but you get the idea. You can use this for manual upgrades. If your users, if you want to upgrade your fleet from 10.13 to 10.14, you can just push this app and instruct the users to go through the normal UI. Again, they're in control of the situation. They click through it as Apple says you should and upgrade to 10.14. This works great in many deployments. You can build an external boot stick using a tool inside the installer application. This is very useful for pre-secure boot Macs. But there's also uses for that, even if you can't boot off it, because you can double-click the application on that external USB stick and walk through the normal upgrade process. Inside the app bundle is also a tool called startosinstall, which Apple didn't acknowledge until last year when 10.13.4 came out, where they finally documented and acknowledged it. Acknowledged, no documentation. You can use this for automated upgrades. If you don't want the UI process, if you want to automate the upgrade, you can use the startosinstall tool. With 10.13.4, we gained the option of having a clean install, erase and install with the startosinstall command. And you can customize the installation process and add your own packages. It's a very powerful, very useful tool. First, you have to get the installer application, all 6 gigabytes of it, onto the drives. You can use VPP for that. There's some problems with sometimes you just get the stub and the bulk will only be loaded when you actually open the app. So most people wrap it up in a package and upload it to your management system, and then you can have the management system push it as any other PKG. And I have a command in the notes. It's a one-liner in terminal to build that PKG. Or you can put it on an external drive. The drive doesn't even have to be bootable. You can just double-click the app from an external drive. If you don't want to copy and keep 6 GB updated on all the devices on your fleet, you can have external drives ready with that. So the upgrade through startosinstall, from the command works just like the UI. You need a Mac with at least Mountain Lion or higher. And you can automate it using the startOS install command. You can put it in your script workflows. There's a few choices in the settings that you can choose. Not that many, but a few. The interesting is the erase install flag. It was added in the 10.13.4 installer application. It will run on any Mac that has APFS. So there's a bit of confusion there. If you're on a 10.13 HFS installation, it won't work. If you're on 10.13.0 with APFS, it will work. It requires APFS and a 10.13.4 or newer installer. There's no UI option for this. Nowhere in the installer application UI does the user have the choice to do a clean install, which is probably a good thing. But in a managed environment, you sometimes want that. So we actually built one. At Pro Warehouse, we sat together and said, we want this, we need this for a customer. We built an app that is double-clickable. It will warn the user several times what's going to happen, do a checklist, like is the network connected, is Find My Mac enabled, and all these things that happen on the phone when you click erase and return to settings, we try to do. And then it will lock the screen so the user can't change their mind after the last warning, while the startOS install command does its preparations, which takes a while because it's copying 6 GB through the file system. And once the startOS install command restarts, well, then the installation takes over. It's written for Mojave, so we have a dark mode. It is open source. The link is in the notes at the end. Please check it out. We're working on an update. We are very proud. It's very useful, and we want to make it more useful for everyone else. So there's a new ecosystem of tools popping up for admins, built on all these new processes and tools that we got from Apple. So the erase install application is one example. There is a very popular macOS upgrade script for Jamf self-service that uses the startOS tool to upgrade. Monkey is aware of the installer application and the startOS tool. And if you import the installer application into Monkey, it will be like, hey, I know what this is. I know what to do with this, and set everything up very nicely so that when the user chooses upgrade in the Monkey managed software, it does the right thing. There are some scripts also written by Greg Nagel called Installer and Bootstrapper that allow you to boot to recovery and use the installer application from recovery to initiate a reset of the machine and inject your own packages. And there's a tool by Tim Perfit of Two Canoes of WinClone fame called MDS, short for MacDeployStick, which goes one step further. He has a dongle that mimics being a keyboard and simulates all the keystrokes necessarily to boot to recovery, open the terminal in recovery, and initiate the restore from there. And everything is stored on the dongle, which also seconds as a USB drive. It's quite brilliant. And he's been working very frantically on that with several updates over the past few months. And this is a new ecosystem that's emerging. We have new tools. We have new community-provided tools that are provided to us. And as we learned yesterday, everyone can code. So this is your chance to maybe invent and show something and bring it back to community. You have to support the most recent macOS version. If you look at the current fleet of Macs, it's a mess. All of them have different requirements for macOS, and they're also very poorly documented. But the MacBook is the oldest with 10.12, and then the latest iMacs that were updated last week, they probably will require a hardware-specific build of 10.14.4. We don't know yet. They're not in anybody's hands yet, but this is very likely. This is hard to support. You don't want to hold on to this. Also, you can't hold on to, say, High Sierra right now because there are so many Macs that require Mojave. You don't have a choice. So if you supported this, that would be much easier. And also, if you supported all Mojave now, it will probably be easier for you to support all 10.15, whatever it's going to be called, in the fall. I wanted to illustrate another change. And again, I have to explain where we're coming from. This is the upgrade cycle that we had 8 years ago. I chose 2011 because that was the first year Apple did the 12-month upgrade cycle. Back then, we had a dedicated beta phase from developers conference to release in the fall. And then we had this early adopter phase. After the release, the first 3 updates, we all knew macOS wasn't really ready yet. It wasn't ripe. You were an early adopter if you adopted then, if you installed then. But then sometime in spring, the .3, .4 release, everything was shaken out, the bugs were fixed, and we would put it into deployment. And if some hardware came out in the interim, we could probably delay that for a few weeks. And then the cycle started over in June with the next beta phase. It was clear we had hats. We could beta test, then we could keep testing the early adopter, and then we would deploy. And the deployment would go on while the next beta phase started. That was easy, manageable. Things have changed. The Mac admin year starts in June, of course, developers conference. The new version is introduced. I'm starting with High Sierra, 2 years ago. Then we have the beta phase, release in the fall, everything's fine. Except, as soon as the release comes out, the .0 version, Apple now makes the beta version of the next update available through the beta portals. We have 3 ways of getting beta right now. You can get it through the developer, which is traditional. You can get it through Appleseed for IT, which ask your Apple SE on how to get in on that. And you can get it through the public beta. Apple has a public beta for iOS and macOS. And every time an update comes out, the next update goes into beta a day or 2 later. And then Apple threw us the wrench with 10.13.4, which wasn't just an update, it added new features. It added new workflows. It added erase install, it added user-approved MDM. There were user-facing features as well. So if you thought you could wait until spring for the early adopter phase to end, you were suddenly faced with completely new workflows with the spring update. And then we got the next update. Mojave was introduced at Developers Conference last summer, and the cycle started over. And, well, this is where we are now. 10.14.4 was released yesterday, and it has new features. It has new pieces that are relevant for the user, but also in the background for the admins. And they also dare to predict the future. 10.15 will, of course, be introduced at Developers Conference, and the cycle will start over. We are in permanent beta mode. We are in permanent testing mode. We can't change our hats through the year. We have to adopt these things as they come. I said already, 10.13.4 added new features. User-facing features, business chat, was more a service. External GPU support was added in 10.13.4, but also user-approved MDM and the erase install flag. The spring update that came out yesterday, we probably don't know everything yet, because not all of the documentation has been updated yet. But of course, it introduces user-facing features. Apple News Plus. If you have the new AirPods ordered, they require 10.14.4 or iOS 12.2 to work. You can't explain to your users, well, you can't use your AirPods because I'm still only supporting High Sierra. Well, most of the users you probably can, but if they're high-level users in your organization, yeah. We got new features as well. We can now control screen capture, allow or disallow screen capture with a profile. We can configure remote desktop and screen sharing access with an MDM command. I think, again, no documentation yet. Also, last week, we got a new feature. Well, we didn't. The other room over there did. School Manager now allows federated Azure AD authentication, which is really exciting. It's not really a 10.14.4 feature, but I put that there because Apple now has all these platforms, all these services, different operating systems. Updates might come through any one of them at any time. And we have to be prepared to use them and adapt to them. AirPods too. They don't fit into any macOS update cycle, but they require 10.14.4, and if you need to support them, well, you need to be on the latest OS. It is possible. It might seem daunting, but it is possible. This is a tweet by Laura Rössler from the SAP Mac admin team in Germany. And last year, after Mojave came out, she tweeted over the course of a few weeks the adoption of Mojave in their fleet. And I turned this into this graph, and I think this is really impressive. It took a bit more than 2 months for 80% of the SAP Mac fleet to be running Mojave. And if you look at the numbers, 80% is, well, their entire fleet is nearly 20,000. Actually, last week, she tweeted that the SAP team passed the 20,000 installed Macs mark worldwide. The remaining 20% are nearly exclusively on 10.13. So they're one version down. And if you look at the numbers, you have to go to her tweets to see the numbers. The number of older operating system is literally in the dozens. Not hundreds, but dozens. And they're probably for legacy software. So we have to adopt new macOS version quickly, mainly for hardware-specific macOS builds, but also for patches and security updates, for new features to go in sync with iOS services and other hardware. And also, Apple is making downgrading harder. If you're trying to go from 10.14.3 or 10.14.4 to 10.13 with a startosinstall command, you're in for a surprise. It won't work. There are other ways, but Apple is making it harder. There are, of course, blockers for this, valid blockers. The most important one is, well, the critical software that we need doesn't run on 10.14. Which, I'm like, yeah, it's been out for 5 months now. What have you been doing? It's even worse if this is your MDM or management system vendor. There are still some out there that don't support Mojave or don't support it officially. I think that's impossible. And if your management system doesn't support Mojave officially yet, there are great vendors out there who are sponsoring the show. Internal support and testing have to be prepared for this. You can't just barge ahead as IT and say, yes, we are going to support the newest OS now, from now on. Support and testing, of course, have to be prepared for this. They need to be able to test the beta versions. The public beta is available. Internal security as well have to do their testing. The security tools have to run on the latest OS. So it's not just you who has to prepare this. You have to do this with other pieces of the company as well. It used to be that people said, well, we can't update to the newest OS because the users aren't used to it. I don't think that's a valid argument anymore. Because with our phones, whether they're on Android or iOS, we are used to updating and the UI changing a bit from version to version. I think users are more flexible than that these days. So modern macOS deployment. You have to have user-approved MDM. You should look at the install macOS application and the startOS install tool. And you have to be able to adapt quickly to macOS. And then you'll be prepared for whatever Apple brings at Developers Conference. My bet is Joshua Tree. We'll see. I'm a bit over time already, but I still want to do this. I don't want to talk about what is, but about what's going to be. I said we have to be on top of the current things, and if we look into the future, that will help us. The first thing is the T2 chip and security. And if T2 taught us everything, is there will be sequels. Plenty of them. Last week's iMac notwithstanding. Last week's iMac was interesting. It does not have the T2 security chip. Basically, speculation is it's just a speed bump. It didn't get a new logic board, didn't get a new design. It didn't get the T2 chip. The big change for the iMac is yet to come. But expect the T2 chip in all forthcoming redesigned Mac models. Apple is not going to go back on that. They like what they can do. They like the privacy and security you can get with the chip. There might be things that enable that Apple can do with the T2 chip that they can't do yet, but that they are doing on iOS. For example, on iOS, I can't install an older iOS version on my phone once I've upgraded. I can't go back. Once the T2 is spread throughout the fleet and the installed base, Apple could do this for the Mac as well. So keep this in mind. This goes into the fast adoption. You have to be prepared. 2 years ago, Apple did something very unusual and strange. They invited a bunch of journalists to talk about the state of the new Mac Pro. And they said, yeah, we know, we've kind of dropped the ball on that one. But there will be a new Mac Pro. That was 2 years ago. We know it'll be in 2019. We don't know much more. I think after watching the session yesterday, I think it probably won't be called Mac Pro, but Mac Plus. Mac Plus has a nice ring to it. I don't know why. We don't know much about the new Mac Pro, except that Apple said it's going to be modular. Well, let's speculate. Modular. Some people think this is modular. It was a great machine. It was very modular. It had PCI slots, and I could switch out the drives. It had 2 optical drive bays. That was a modular great machine. I don't think that's what Apple currently thinks is modular anymore. I think this is more relevant, this is my speculation, to what Apple thinks is modular. You can attach an external GPU to a MacBook Pro through Thunderbolt. This is powerful. This is awesome. Thunderbolt 3 is wonderful. The Mac Mini has 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports. That's like 4 PCI slots. Apple also said they're working on a new display. I used the old one. But it's a frame with a screen. So, I mean, things like this will be possible. The display will have Thunderbolt 3, I assume. So will it look like this, or will Apple put the external GPU in the display? What will that mean? Do I have to upgrade GPUs or displays every few years? Displays last a long time, GPUs don't. This is interesting. Also, with Thunderbolt 3, the display turns into a switch and a dock. We have that with the Thunderbolt display, and with Thunderbolt 3, this is going to get stronger. And of course, this won't only work with the MacBook Pro, but also now with the iPad Pro, which has USB-C and can power an external display. So there are thoughts from what we know already that might inform how you want to prepare for that. At Developers Conference, Apple introduced something called, well, they don't call it Marzipan, everybody else does. It seems to be the internal code name. iPad apps on macOS. In Mojave, we got 4 of them. They're Apple only. It's a private framework for now. It will be opened up with 10.15. How will that affect us? Well, all of these iPad apps, supposedly this volume of iPad apps that will come to us from the iOS platform, they will be in the Mac App Store. The iPad developers are used to that. They don't have the same problems with it as the macOS developers do. They will use the Mac App Store. We were able to ignore the Mac App Store and VPP up to now, but if there's useful apps coming in through this, we won't be able to anymore. And by the way, Microsoft Office is now on the Mac App Store. Transmit, who were on the Mac App Store and left, are back. BBEdit is now sandboxed in preparation to return to the Mac App Store. So we won't be able to ignore the Mac App Store and VPP any longer. There are questions that need to be solved. App subscriptions, how do I do those with VPP? In-app purchases? There's no answers for that yet. I'm looking to Developers Conference. And then the last one, big rumor, macOS on ARM. There was an article in Bloomberg last year about that, but also when Apple did the iPad Pro update last year and the Geekbench Results benchmarks came out, everybody was like, oh, look, the A12 chip doesn't just compete with low-end MacBooks anymore. It competes with the higher-end MacBooks. So yeah, wouldn't it be nice if we had that in a notebook, in a laptop? It would make Apple independent of Intel, and being dependent on Intel's release cycle has certainly burnt Apple in the past. And also ARM chips need less power and are better for mobility. So I personally am an ARM skeptic. I think Apple already has an ARM-based platform that they think is the future of mobile computing, and that's the iPad Pro. But I can also see the pros, and there might be an ARM-based Mac in the future. So what will that mean for us as admins? Well, it will certainly require secure boot. It will be closer to iOS. We'll probably have a signed operating system, and they will deprecate older versions of the operating system very quickly. So more reason to have fast OS adoption. MDM management will be required, but we have that already. And the binaries, well, they will probably go through the App Store. So all things that we covered earlier, if you do them right now, if you prepare for them right now, whatever Apple throws at us in the future, you should be well prepared because you kind of thought ahead and were on top of things. So with that, I'm way over time. I thank you for your indulgence. I put a website up. I hope it works. On my website, scriptingos10.com/modern. I will leave that up for now and for a while. And thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Do we have time for a bit of Q&A? Yeah. So questions? Everybody's overwhelmed. There's one.
I can pass it to you. You talked about all the various technologies that had gone away, and you blamed that all on the T2 chip. Obviously, it's more complex than that. But,
yes.
I was just wondering, you mentioned Apple Remote Desktop as something that was still working, but was on the way out. We're finding a lot of difficulty connecting to some computers through Remote Desktop, and I was wondering if that was related to the T2 chip.
I don't think it's related to the T2 chip. I've been working with Remote Desktop for literally decades, and it's always had these problems. It's when the agent stops talking to your machine, and then the IP address doesn't update. It's always had these problems. I don't think they're ever going to be fixed. That's why I classified it as a zombie, because... Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Remove it, re-add it. That usually fixes it for a while. Any more questions? With that, I'll be around. You can talk to me. Enjoy the rest of the conference.